Fantastic. Good morning, everybody. As Craig said, welcome. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome. If you're joining us again, welcome. We will probably come back to this several times, but we've talked about the toolbar. That's where you can find your closed captioning. And it's also where you can find the Q&A. So if you do have questions, the Q&A is a really good place to put them. It allows Craig to see them easily. And you can also, excuse me, you can pop them in there anonymously if you want to. If you put them in the chat, Craig might catch them. You have hundreds, literally, of other people who may answer them for you there too, but they may not come to us. So feel free to use the chat and the Q&A for those specific questions, please. As always, at the beginning of a Friday, we like to start with a deep recognition for where we are, where we've been, and where we're heading to. Okintis is the traditional name for what we now call Calgary. Okintis stands for where two rivers meet, the Elbow River and the Bow River. What you can see on your screen is SAIT's main campus, a building called Heritage Hall in all its glory. Looking at the blossom on the trees, I've fast forwarded a couple of months for you there as to what is coming. But it is important to us to note that we are located on traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 that includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kaurna, the Tsuut'ina, the Îyârhe Nakoda of Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney. This is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. Thanks, Craig.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenny. And folks, as always, thank you for joining us. And get a sip of coffee in there, as was suggested to me in the chat. But I just popped something in the chat before we get going. Please do follow SAIT Corporate Training. It's a great place to stay up to date on everything that's going on here and the upcoming events. Please don't hesitate to connect with Jenny or I on LinkedIn as well. We will be back not until April 4th. We've got some vacation time coming up here, but April 4th we'll be back and talking about hybrid teams because it is still a very important conversation to have. And actually, Jenny might play into a little bit of today's discussion around one-on-ones, whether you're virtual or face-to-face. If you want to catch up on past episodes, you can find us on Apple, Spotify, and if you want to watch us again, I'm not sure why anybody wants to watch me again, but there's a link there to our past webinars as well. So today, one-on-one conversations, and folks, the chat has been very engaged so far. So I'm going to ask the chat a question. I'll try to keep an eye on it, and then Jenny and I are going to start our conversation. We'll come back to the chat. But from a one-on-one perspective, what makes them great? What makes them terrible? Feel free to throw your thoughts in the chat as we go on here, but would love to hear that. But Jenny, I think the question for me is, why are these so important? I'm just going to start there and let's use that as the trailhead.
It's a little question with a great big huge answer, but I think the simple answer is they're so important because this is about your people and this is about you to a degree. We have to be careful how we say that. And I think you had a good point when we were talking offline. Which way around is the one and the one? Is it employee, leader, leader, employee within there? So this is your opportunity to really recognize and engage with your employee, with your report, with your individual contributor, whoever it might be. I mean, there's no reason why one-on-ones can't happen within a team too. That's a bit of a progressive conversation. So I think the most important reason is that we can connect with our employee. And if we say connection, then we immediately think of seen, heard, and valued. Those are important ingredients.
Yeah. Yeah, I just jotting a couple of down. You've triggered a couple of thoughts for me. But as I'm going through and looking at the chat here, some interesting conversations around great being consistency and follow-up. Terrible. Lots of comments in here around agendas for one-on-one. So I think we can dig into that perhaps a little bit. One-sided conversations. Employee receives tailored feedback and guidance. One-on-ones can only be successful if there's trust, mutual respect, and understanding. Absolutely. Some great things in here to dig into. So I guess for me, I think you said something really important there that's probably worth double clicking on to start with. If you are the leader, you know, hosting the one-on-one, let's just assume let's go with that. I book a one-on-one with my team. I'm the host of the one-on-one, but the meeting really is theirs. It's
Yeah.
about them. It's about what's going on for them, what's their challenges, um, and I think that's probably one of the first places that many of these go sideways is if you're not focused on the employee coming into the conversation, things probably aren't going to be great for them. You want them leaving feeling engaged and heard and that you actually listened to them in that conversation. So I don't know
Yeah.
what that spurs for you, but those are just some of the, I'm going to quit trying to weave big questions together and just give you my stream of consciousness and let you react.
Yeah. And then find your coffee. No, the starting piece that you said there was one of the most important ones. You're hosting this. So when we host something, what does that mean? And so, when this becomes a checklist or a prescribed conversation or because we have to, then it becomes a complete and utter waste of time from both sides. And invariably, we fall into patterns and those patterns get stale. So I love what you said in terms of hosting it, because when you host somebody, you welcome them, you're curious about them, you're interested in them. And that's the whole part within this. And when we meet with the same, I'll use the word expectations, but be careful because they take on a whole new persona. But if we meet with the same expectation that this is our chance to connect and dig into what's important to me, understanding that you're my leader, then we meet at a different level than if we meet understanding or starting with what's important to you. That said, I don't actually have a problem with it flip-flopping within the conversation. Like this is a
Yep.
conversation, it's going to go backwards and forwards. But the danger when it starts with what's important to the leader, and let's go to those agendas, a leader sets the agenda, then it becomes all about them, and that's often outcome driven. And the problem, and you said this, there's the focus piece, the person that you're chatting with, they're in the experience. How do I get to the outcome? That's what the conversation really wants to be about, is the how. They know the what because that's shown up in your other meetings or other communications or even a different one-on-one. This is about the how. How are you getting there? How are you doing? How's the work going? How are the priorities stacking? No, I'm stacking questions. Like that's just sort of a premise that we could start from.
Yeah, and I think what's so important in there, and we were chatting about this before we got on screen here this morning, is separating the one-on-one conversations, right,
Mhm.
from the status updates.
Yeah.
Right. And so, depending on the nature of your role as a leader and depending on the nature of your business, if you're a sales leader, you're going to be looking at a sales opportunity pipeline and wanting to know what's going on with each one and how it's moving forward. If you're leading projects, you're probably having check-ins on your projects as they proceed. I'm obviously not a project manager. I'm just pretending to know the language. But I think the signal that you can send as a leader by separating the check-in, the progress status updates from the one-on-one conversations. And it can be difficult because you're busy, you've got things going on, your
Mm.
calendar is probably full of all sorts of blocks. When you've got your employee there for that one-on-one, it can be really tempting to bring in all the status pieces into that one-on-one. And then all of a sudden you've got to the last 10 minutes and it's like, okay, well, tell me how you're doing.
Yes, yeah, start with that. That would be a great place to start. Um, okay, so I think you brought up probably one of the most important points from my perspective is that we're very, I don't know, I think it's a drive for efficiency and one-on-ones are not efficient. Like it takes time to build relationship. It takes time to have a conversation. So what we do is we book an hour and we simply list all the things that we have to talk about, which to me suggests we're not talking between this one-on-one and that one-on-one, which
Mm,
goes against the grain of what leadership is about. And so the question is really, what do we need from this conversation? And so what often happens is if we book an hour, we try and cover it all in there. And if I'm talking about this in a classroom, you literally have two handfuls of those, like the stress balls. And if you throw them all at one person, they can't catch any of them. So we actually leave with less richness than we could have done if we just met for 20 minutes. And Craig, it might be as simple as Jenny, how are you?
Yeah.
Like it might be that simple sometimes. And another time it might be, what's going on and how do you need my help? Marcus Buckingham, we talk about quite often, it says 15 minutes for your check-in. And he's got four golden questions. I've got them on a slide for everybody for later, but 15 minutes per person, but per week. And the key is that this happens. It doesn't matter whether it's brilliant or not. It's not going to be brilliant every single time, but the key is that it happens every week. And for those of you who are now panicking, like, I can't do that every week, I've got people everywhere. It actually, by the research, doesn't matter if it happens in a different mode. So we might meet face to face one week, we might meet like this virtually another week, but another time it might be a Teams conversation that is
Yeah.
that check-in. But it's the check-in that drives the engagement. It's the check-in that's the leadership piece.
Yeah. And for me, it's also the demonstration of the importance, if you want to use the word sacredness of
Mm,
that time,
yep,
right? How many of us as the employee in the one-on-one have had the one-on-one rescheduled, rescheduled, rescheduled,
yep.
right?
Which just diminishes it in true format, actually diminishes trust because you're reducing the reliability. And to your point, the value that that person holds. You devalue the person quite simply.
Absolutely. And that's not to say you should never reschedule a one-on-one. Like there's stuff's
Yeah.
going to happen, right? Stuff happens in the flow of business where all of a sudden, something's crashing down and you really do need to change, or you get pulled into um, a meeting with senior leadership and you can't change it. Although it is sometimes interesting to say to your senior leaders, no, I can't make that because,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and just
I'm
leave that there.
brilliant.
There was something that came through in the chat here. I noticed, what about the frequency of one-on-ones? And I'll go with the statement of, I think you need to look at one-on-ones being as frequent as you need them for your business and for your team member. The check-in, I agree, Jenny. Once a week may seem like a lot, but it's your job as a leader to find out how folks are doing. And to your point, that quick check-in could be 10, 15 minutes. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we seem to think in hour time blocks thanks to Outlook. Right. So when we book a one-on-one, it may show up as a 30-minute slot or a 1 hour slot. But thoughts on frequency for that deeper one-on-one conversation, if we want to use that
This will
phrase.
depend. Yeah, I think you sort of nailed it. And it does depend on your leadership style. Unfortunately, many leaders today are working leaders. They have to do a lot more than lead. So they're doing the work and leading people. So there is a time piece in there. And too many leaders have too many people. Like, you have 40 people, you can't see 40 people a
Yeah.
week. And that's a crazy number to be trying to lead. So really, it's very individual. I think there needs to be a check-in of some kind weekly, and that's a non-negotiable, but it doesn't have to be an hour and it doesn't have to be face to face every time. And then the cadence is going to depend on how you're working with your other leadership. So if you're very good at providing in real time feedback or feed forward, as we like to call it so often, then those conversations are still happening. And sometimes there's a couple in a week, and sometimes there isn't one of those for a month or so. And when we get to that goal reviewing is again part of leadership. Do you want that to be combined with your one-on-one or not? So I think the first thing for leaders in this space is to pause and look at their team. To your point, look at the industry that they're in. What does that define? And then what is the best way forward? And one of the easiest ways to answer those questions is to talk to your people. If you don't have a relationship with your people, they're not going to tell you. So your first step might be build the relationship, build the trust. And we build trust. We've said this so many times through Charles Feltman's work, 4 different ways that you can build trust. And you can build that. It's not on them to build it with you. You can build it. And those 4 things, for anybody who's missed it previously: competence, reliability, sincerity, and care. right? And we can build within them. And if you go back, Craig posted the history earlier, there's a couple of conversations where those pop up. So I would, make sure you've got the relationship, engage your employee and what's going to work best for them and how, and then try that cadence. And if that cadence isn't working for you, then stop and look at it again. We get too much into the pattern of, "Oh, I've got this booked and therefore we're done."
Yeah. Yeah. Or, there's times where, we've got it booked, but maybe we just mutually agree we can wait a week,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think, something that just clicked here for me is, and I want to be clear that, when we're talking about separating status updates or goals and objectives from the one-on-one discussion, there's always going to be some blurring,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's not going to be, no, we're not talking about that right now. This is our one-on-one time.
Yeah.
Right? If it comes up, it's obviously important to your employee who's there with you, right?
Well, if you come
I
back,
we don't want to, what we're saying is we don't want to necessarily run the one-on-one with, I've got my list of things that I want updates from you on,
Mhm.
right? If you bring it up, fantastic, because it's clearly on your mind.
And there's the scope to take us back to the agenda. Have your
Mm.
employee write the agenda, and then they're bringing what's important to them to the meeting. And if nothing that you need is on there, then A, do you extend it? Or B, is that a separate meeting where you switch the one around? Like we said, employee to leader, leader to employee. That could be two different 30-minute meetings, if you like, two different 15-minute meetings, and you're still taking the same time. They're just separated within there.
Yeah,
On
yeah,
that note, too, I have seen it was a pretty good idea with all the digital tools that you can use now. There is scope maybe for a shared document between you and your report.
yep,
And if there is a cadence that you both like within those meetings, you can kind of populate it early to say, here, heads up, here's what I would want to be talking about. And that if that's shared, it also gives you sort of that record of where you've been and what you've talked about too, which can be handy depending on how your systems are set up.
yeah. And I think we can come back to and just chat about kind of those notes and follow-up
Mhm.
pieces as a one-on-one, but there's some questions that have come up here that I think we should jump on. So how do I engage thoughtfully with a team member who perceives every piece of feedback negatively? So I'm going to assume that you're a leader in the team in this one-on-one, and the feedback that I'm sharing with you, Jenny, you just like, yeah, that's not right.
Yeah, this is really difficult because it may not have anything to do with you as a leader. We all arrive with our story, our experience. And unfortunately, and we had this conversation, I think in January, Craig, feedback typically has been one lousy experience after another. So people will go on the defensive really, really quickly if our language isn't quite sort of keeping them on the sort of composure and growth line. So I think the first thing is to recognize it. And that might sound like, I notice when I offer feedback from my perspective, it doesn't land well. It's hard without knowing the people. You have to play with the language there, but just to notice it. And, very often those kind of reactions come from a fear of some kind. And that fear of some kind can be rooted in, fear of failure. It could be rooted in fear of judgment. It could just simply be past experiences where we don't want the same thing to happen again, but we don't have the skill set to articulate that. And there is a piece, we talked about this in the feedback episode. How do you set each other up for success to receive feedback? So have you asked that employee what the best way is? It might be better for it to come written for them beforehand if it's specific. And that, I mean, that's the other thing, check in, is it specific and is it actionable so that they can read it, digest it, and then ask their questions. Other people will just prefer the straight conversation and rumbling through it. So it might be a chance to get to know what they need differently, better from there.
Yeah, and I think that ties in a little bit with the next question too, is, can you please speak to how you change the tone or the conversation with an employee who's always in a negative state and has something negative to say about every initiative? Hey, my my
Yeah,
initial thought is sometimes you have to call it out, right?
I would be looking for I use an acronym all the time. It feels old now, but it's so useful. if you listen for, like, if you've got that kind of conversation, listen for blame, excuses, and denial. And the acronym for those three is bed. You're going to get stuck in bed. The conversation is going to get stuck. And so if you hear those, they're easy to, excuse me, they're easy to sort of capture. I can hear, you can do it with your team too. I can hear us blaming whoever. I can hear us, denying that this is even the case. Or it sounds like a little bit of an excuse. And the flip side of it is, what do we own in this conversation? Where's the ownership? And then from there, you can shift into accountability, you can shift into responsibility. And I think the other piece to really that sort of helps is to bring the control back to where the control is, which is with the person, control the controllables.
Yeah.
And so if that negativity is all on stuff that there's absolutely no control over, there's actually a waste of time. And so come back to where you have control, because then you can take action. And if your action is the right action at the right time, then that's going to feel better. And some people move within sort of negativity, worst case scenario. It's exhausting, but it's also the way that they see the world. So it's sometimes just being in that conversation, be curious and dig into it a little bit.
Yeah. Um, Somewhat on this line of within the meeting itself, we've talked about agenda. It was mentioned that it's very important that the meetings stay on point. I'm curious whether they should always only follow the agenda set out, or if it seems okay to leave space or have informal conversation.
I'm a big fan of, in this particular case where we're talking true one-on-one, I'm a big fan of letting the conversation go where the conversation goes, as long as your employee, well, feels seen, heard, and valued and has their what they need answered for that meeting. But if it wanders, it wanders.
Yeah. And I think if you, as the leader, are focused on your agenda for the one-on-one, that's where they may not leave feeling seen, heard, and valued.
Hmm.
If you recognize the conversation is starting to wander and we've probably as leaders all had those one-on-ones where something's been building up in an employee and all of a sudden it comes out in a time you're like, where did that come from?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And the agenda at that point means absolutely nothing because you have to go down that rabbit hole or
Hmm.
you have to lean into it. But I think, the time then is to figure out how do you find time to get back to answer the other things that might have been on the agenda, right? It's
Yeah.
okay to acknowledge it in the moment. Hey, we're going a little off track from what you wanted. I'm fine with that. This is your time,
Yeah.
you know? So I don't know. I think to your point, absolutely. And some of the best stuff comes out of that informal or the unexpected conversation pieces.
Especially, yes. And within there is a real opportunity that I've seen. I can't track the chat quick enough, but I've seen notes to sort of trust and the safety in the relationship. And for a leader, your productive response to what's coming out is everything in creating that environment that creates a safe space. You've given them space for the conversation, and then your productive response is crucial. So to your point, like, where did that come from? When we're productive in that, this is important to you, or like, I see you're really passionate about this area,
Mhm.
that encourages and opens up the conversation. And so, even if it doesn't feel important to you, you're like, this is trivial, to them it is. And that's the part that we want to engage in.
Yeah. Couple questions I'm going to tie together here because I think they really speak to trust, and
Okay.
mostly because the first question has trust in it. What do you do if you don't trust your boss and they ask how you are? And then the other one that I'm going to put that in here, any tips on how to gain people's trust in new teams so they start to share their pain points instead of saying everything's okay?
How are you? And then they answer fine. We know that fine is always some kind of acronym or story.
It is
So
a four-letter word.
it is, yeah. Well, building trust is work. Like, that's the first thing. And building trust is two-way. So if I'm building trust, they're building trust. As I assess whether I trust you, they're assessing or you're assessing whether you trust me. So if we want to build trust, the quickest and I think most effective way is to use that model from Charles Feltman that we use it all the time in the work that we do. So you've got four different avenues to build trust. Leaders generally are focusing, looking at that competence and reliability. But remember, within competence, it's not about perfection. It's not about everything that you can do. It's also about what you can't do. So recognizing that and making that part of the conversation. So competence and reliability. For leaders listening, your team, your employees often are looking for the sincerity and the care aspect. So how will you extend care? How do you remain sincere within here? And so the easiest way to build trust is to look at what's your part in that relationship and where are you maybe missing one of those four and what are the actions that you can do to build within there. And so that puts the control back in your seat. You're in charge of that and you can work with that. It may not become reciprocal straight away, but that kind of continuous work generally leads to we match each other and we move within there. The other thing too is that when somebody asks you how you are and they wait and they listen for the answer, they probably care a little bit about what that answer is. But the ball is in your hands as to how much you want to say. You don't have to tell them exactly how you are if you don't want to. And so if what you've got for them today is, I'm doing good. I'm concerned about this, or I'm doing good. I've really enjoyed working on this recently. That can be an answer. We don't have to dig into deep tunnels in those conversations if we don't choose to.
Yeah, perfect. Tons of questions here, Jenny. This is
Oh,
fantastic. So I'm going to come to, is it fair to have a parking lot when the one-on-one conversation goes awry? I think yes,
yes,
right? Absolutely. I think,
but come back to it.
yeah, come back to it, whether it's in that meeting or whether it's after that meeting,
Yes.
come back to it and say, listen, we went down this rabbit hole and we lost track of these other things, or we agreed to park the rabbit hole so we could focus on these things. Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
there's no like there's no perfect way of doing these one-on-ones other than I think to Jenny's point, when your employee leaves the conversation, they feel like you heard them. They feel like you gave a damn for however long you were there and
Mhm.
that you were engaged. Um, Interesting. What can you do if every time you ask for feedback from your leader during the one-on-one, the response you get is, you're doing great, right? What am I
Here's
doing great in? You get a generic response from your leader. How can you get your leader to provide specific feedback?
change the question and ask for specific feedback. So in your next one-on-one, say between now and the next time we meet, can you please spend some time looking at X, whatever that is, make it narrow the focus, make it easy for them. And you're asking them to look for what they're noticing or give me your insights on and set them up with a specific quest. And then next time, hopefully you'll get some feedback on that because sometimes your leader truly thinks you're great. And that's a compliment. Take the compliment in the space. It'd be nice if it came with more words, but it didn't. But it's still the compliment and the appreciation. So that's cool. And then if you're asking the question, you know what you're looking for. So pick the one that's most important to you and set them up for that.
Yeah. Joanne pointed out in the chat, the what worked well and what would be even better if
Yeah.
might be a great way to go here as well, right?
Yeah.
And so, what advice do you have for a leader whose own manager doesn't see the value of regular one-on-ones with team members? Do you have any thoughts on best practices for demonstrating their impact and advocating for them?
I think this is like that. When you drop a touch of dye into a glass of water and it kind of spreads. Like it doesn't mean that you need to stop having your one-on-ones. If you build relationship, you build engagement, you build purpose and passion, that's going to gain momentum and the value will show through in the kind of team that you've built. It's tricky if you don't have someone to have that conversation with, if they don't believe in it. So my
Mm,
suggestion maybe there is who can you have those conversations with? Who do you share your thoughts, your needs, that part with? That's the bit that might be a bit more difficult in that equation. But I would keep having them. And I mean, if you're told not to, that's kind of a serious area right there. But most of our cadence of conversations happen ad hoc too.
Yeah. Another approach too that you might think about is, if they're not willing to have that one-on-one with you, think about the regular status updates that you can provide. I know this is going back against the earlier conversation around one-on-ones or in status updates, but if you're showing your leader, you're trying to engage them in that conversation around, if you're providing a one-page update and then perhaps some questions for them
Yes.
to, right, might start that conversation. And then, hey, all of a sudden, you know what, it might just be easier to meet versus you sending me a Word document once a week. I don't know,
Fair enough.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Um, what if you truly do have an employee who is great and you've been looking for constructive feedback and there's just nothing? Trust me, I've looked, is the parenthetical close to that.
Well, congratulations, because you have
Absolutely.
that employee. That's awesome. Um, I'll ask them. Ask them similar to what I just said. Is there somewhere in particular that you'd like me to pay attention, to pay specific attention? Um, I think that's the easiest way. Like when we talk about self-actualization, I don't think it's possible to ever be the best you can be apart from in the moment. This is really weird. Work with me here. So, like, if you ask Michael Phelps, he will always tell you that he could have been a better swimmer. He just retired before he went to that next
Hmm.
piece. So, anything within that realm. And it's the same thing. We can craft our expertise, and to those who don't find it easy, it seems like, oh, it's brilliant, it's excellent. But most times the person in it knows that there are areas where they could be better, or they could change it, or they would like some, how's this landing with the other person? Because we only have our perception. So, within a classroom, there are things that I would, if I put my mind to it, absolutely love for people to notice and give me feedback on. And so if your employee is great, they probably have their own thoughts. And if you catch them off guard and you say, well, what would you like me to notice? I think that everything is excellent. Be honest with that, because that kind of validation lifts people incredibly, and see where they come to. And they might not have an answer, but it might be that they want to grow in a different space as well. And maybe that's part of what they can do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually, I'm looking ahead at the slides. You've got a question in at the end that I think addresses that and is, what is one skill or talent you have
Yeah.
that I've overlooked, undervalued, or underutilized? Right? That might be the opportunity for that employee who's truly great to say, well, I'd really like to try and do
Yes.
X. Like there
Yeah.
might be a project there that you can carve out for them. So I think you're looking for that opportunity to help them stretch. If there's no true next role for them yet, how do you find it perhaps with different projects, different ways of utilizing their skills? So
Mhm.
a couple of questions tied together here, basically the same one. What are your thoughts on skip level one-on-ones?
Love it. Yes, do
Right.
more of
Next
it.
question.
Keep going. And I think they're brilliant. I think any leader that makes the time for them, who is genuinely curious and interested, will learn so much in there. To me, that's better than any engagement survey ever.
Yeah. And so I think the thing you need to as a lead, so if you're a leader going one level below your direct report,
Hmm.
I think so if you're a leader of leaders essentially, right, and you're going below your manager, I think the key thing to make sure you're doing to set those up though is let your manager know that you're
100%.
doing them, why you're doing them, what you're hoping to learn, what you're hoping to gain.
Yes.
Just suddenly doing them without setting that up could be cause for just a little bit of anxiety, perhaps in
And it
some.
breaks the trust again. Yes. No, I absolutely agree with you. And encourage. So if you're a leader of leaders, like encourage it. Encourage it all the way through, and
Yeah.
potentially even sideways too. Like if your
Yeah.
company is a little bit siloed, it's a great way to bust silos too. If you hold a leader position, stop and talk to anybody. Like make
Yeah.
that opportunity available. Yeah.
Yeah, or the other way up. So if you're a leader who's, you know, in between, you're a leader of leaders and you report to a leader,
Yeah.
how do you get your leader to also demonstrate the same thing? So it starts to normalize it a bit,
Yes.
right? That this now, if your organization has never engaged in it before, and you, like I say, you just start doing it, that can be concerning for some folks, right? Also depending on what's going on in the company at the time. So, um, what do you do if your leader points to a mistake that you made? You fixed it with a procedure or process, and they still bring it up in your one-on-one again and again.
And again and again. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So first off, we all make mistakes, and very, very few mistakes are blameworthy. So if you are a leader listening to this, be careful what you're doing when people make mistakes because you're human too, and you've probably made mistakes as well. So owning them, learning from them is a key part within the psychological safety. And those who want to dig deep in there, Amy Edmondson has a continuum of failures. There's some good information on YouTube these days around that because it's quite new. And then the other part, so if you're sitting on the receiving end of that and it keeps coming up, again, I'd notice it and say, this mistake happened here. It was fixed via the right process. We acknowledge that. And I'm curious as to its reappearance now. Is there something that's still hanging on? Is there something that we didn't talk about there? That does require a relationship to be able to bring the
Yeah.
conversation to that level. But if it is again and again and again, which I think is what we heard there, then let's catch that because there's something that hasn't been dealt with or answered or whatever that might be.
Yeah. Don't let it linger. A great phrase that I think I heard from our friend Ela is, I think there's a conversation that we've missed,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
100%. Yes.
It's a
And that
great
is,
way to
yeah.
great way to lean into that one.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try and tie a couple of questions together here, Jenny. So, one, how do you design one-on-ones in a way that it will be interesting and something to look forward to? Along with, what are some questions to spark the one-on-one conversation?
Okay. First half of that one, engage your employees because this is about them, not just about you. So designing it, have a think about the conversations that you need to have and the cadence and involve them in the conversation too, because you have a diversity of people on your team. And so everybody's going to have a slightly different play on that. So we've got to meet the needs and meet the diversity piece as well. In planning them, I'd really encourage you to think outside of the 1 hour box. And so, as we've said throughout the conversation, what is the conversation that you need to have? If you are catching those priority moments where feedback is needed, right? There is a mistake or there is a flaw or there's a performance piece. Our job is to increase performance.
Yep.
Then have those separately, have that as a different cadence as often as it needs to be, because then it's a small conversation, and then keep your one-on-one as that rich, organic conversation time. The questions to spur the one-on-one, we've got 3 slides. I'm asked to provide 3 questions. We've got one with 2, one with 3, and one with 4. So we've about 9 questions for you at the end of today. That will generate some thought, I would think.
We'll get to those shortly. So we've gone from 3 questions to 3 slides. Um, what do you think of a one-on-one meeting where all the employee ever wants to do is vent? Is this still valuable time spent?
To start with, yes, because if they need to vent, they're penting a lot up. So listen carefully to what the vent is. If it's a pattern, then there's probably something to notice in there. And that might be within your team dynamics. Like this is where it's important to listen to what they're venting about,
Yeah.
because you could have maybe a team dynamic issue, something going on there. And so once you've found the pattern of what the venting is about, it will allow you to help to reduce that part, I would think.
Yeah. And I think too, depending on where the employee is at, I think you sometimes have to trust your instinct as a leader and know if the venting is a deflection from other things that might be going on, because that could be happening as well. Sometimes with my team, I will do this in a team setting, not often, maybe a couple times a year, but you take 15, 20 minutes and just have a controlled, you know what session.
Yeah.
Let's hear it all, folks. Let's list it out because in there is probably a nugget of some truth. And there's probably something in one of those sessions that you can go, oh, I can do something about
Hmm.
this.
Hmm.
And if as a leader you catch those things in that you know what list and then
Yep.
bring it back and show that you've corrected it, you're gaining a lot there with your team.
You can do, yeah, for sure. And another version of that, I think it's Corporate Rebels that it comes from, is I forget what they call it, something like a problem fest. So they have space for all the problems, just not to be solved, just to be aired. And then they can work from there within where they need to go to or what the obstacles are or how to solve them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jenny, uh, we're going to have to think about answers to questions post
Okay.
event here because we're 8:42 and you do have 3 slides of questions to
I
share
do.
with folks. So, folks, we will figure out a way to address the questions that we haven't gotten to in the chat. I really want to thank you all because it's been an amazing conversation here this morning with lots of great questions here. I think we will be coming back to this topic again, Jenny.
We're going to try to run a 2.0 series, I think,
Yeah.
on a few of these. Okay, let's do this so we can get everybody out of here long before 9 o'clock. So this is a little extra, but I think the key to take away from this is make sure your one-on-ones happen and remember frequently over brilliantly. So it doesn't have to be brilliant every single time. You may not have a wonderful coaching insight every time, but your people feel seen, heard, and valued when they happen. And that's key. So our one big idea, we always finish with one big idea, two things that you can take away and use straight away, and theoretically 3 questions. But today we've got 3 slides of questions for our one-on-one. So you can see the big idea in there. Lose the prescription of these, create the experience that your report needs for that given moment on that given day. That's going to require some adaptability and some flexibility, but I think the dividends come pretty quickly within there. Two things that you can take away. We talked about this quite a bit. I love these 2 pictures from Unsplash. Chris Shambrook brought them to my attention. And the photographers simply changed the focus. And as leaders, we are often focused on the target. We're focused on the outcome. We're driven by the outcome. And interestingly enough, employees much more focused on the how. And that's the important part. That's the leadership. So, how is it going for them? How are they faring? That is a really rich conversation. So, your takeaway is that acronym what? Wait, what am I telling myself? Or why am I talking? In the voice share of a one-on-one conversation, the employee needs the higher figure in that number. Second thing, and I turned it into 3. We're full of, well, there's too much to say here, but 3 things that you can think about in what's important to them in their conversation. What does their Jenga stack look like? Like everybody is balancing priorities, unfortunately, in that kind of format. So, what is it that they need help with? It will probably be a little different than what you're seeing, but it's important when it comes from them. If you're going into the feed forward conversation, remember you're going in the direction of the car. There's no need to look in the rearview mirror too much at all. We want to go forwards. And those goals have been set. Reviewing them is the leadership hit. That's the how part within there. And then the final part in there, lots and lots of people in lots and lots of organizations just feel like one of many. So you paying attention is the most important part of that conversation, not your advice, not your suggestions, actually not your feedback. It's simply you paying attention to that other human in front of you. And then to the questions. So if you want to go simple, here's 2 questions to leave today with. Are your one-on-ones the best possible use of your time? If you can't answer that with an emphatic yes, then maybe take a pause and relook at them. And then what are the conversations that you need to have? We've talked about that lots today. Three questions that might help you to build trust and connection. You can see the second one in there that Craig mentioned earlier. And that's a great question to ask because you'll be surprised by the answers. And that's a really cool place for them to engage in the conversation to start from. But knowing the other two help you to know the human in front of you, and that will engage and spark better conversation. And then the last one with four questions, these actually come from Marcus Buckingham, and these are the four questions that he suggests every leaders run 52 times a year. So 15 minutes per week with each of your people. They're actually very clever questions because they look back a little bit and they also focus on the future. Be careful, the words are very intentional. So love and loathe, they're strong, but that's because they drive an emotional connection. But as a leader, the amount of data that you will get from having this conversation with your reports is huge. I will put Marcus Buckingham's book in our resources that come out with the slides. So Craig will send an email. You click on it, you can see all of these slides and some extra resources that will help in this space if you need them. There we go. 3 slides, lots of questions. We're done.
Well done. Yeah. And so thank you, everybody. We are back April 4th. Sorry, it's going to be a month, but there's just vacations and things that get in the way here. But we're back April 4th, and stay tuned to the State Corporate Training page. We will have the remainder of April, May, June sessions posted very soon. And with that, have yourselves a fantastic Friday, a fantastic weekend. Jenny, as always, thank you. I appreciate you. And we'll talk to everybody soon. Take care.
You're very welcome. Have a good holiday. Take care, everybody.
All right.